So, hello to everyone joining us for the recording. Now, how your speech of introduction is actually going to be turned in is, how you're going to turn in your speech of introduction is you're, just like with the speech activity that a couple of you might have already done already, you're just going to record yourself giving your speech of introduction using the GoReact software on Canvas. You upload it, and then once you've uploaded your speech of intro, as you might have seen with your speech of introduction rubric, it's a required part of each of your speeches that you then watch two of your classmates' speeches, give feedback as described on the speech of introduction rubric. Again, very similar to the speech activities, very similar to the reading discussions. But basically what you're going to be doing is you're going to be watching through someone's speech. You're then going to list one thing you liked about their speech, one thing they could improve upon for the future in their speech, and one other thing you liked. You want to be specific in your feedback, because the more specific your feedback is, the more helpful it's going to be to the actual speaker. Imagine if when you check your speech, you then check that the only feedback you got was someone who typed, "It was good," or "I liked it." Can you do anything with that? Does that really tell you your strengths and weaknesses as a public speaker when someone just says, "Yeah, it was good"? Be specific. Say, "I really liked how you used your gestures. I really liked how you used your movement throughout the room. I really liked your opener, your attention gainer. It was very funny. It grabbed my eye or ear or whatever. I really liked how you ended your speech. I really liked how you closed out with the quote you started with," and so on. The more specific your feedback, the more helpful to your audience. Just know that peer feedback is a required part of your speech grade. You will lose points if you don't provide that feedback. So, getting a little bit ahead of myself, but let me begin how I always begin, by asking if anyone has any questions about the course, any questions about any upcoming assignments, about your speech, the activity, the reading discussion. Any questions at all?
I have one.
Go ahead, Luke.
If I start videoing on my actual speech, it is okay if I send it to you, get your approval before I submit it to Canvas?
Well, I don't necessarily know what you mean by approval, but you're free to send it to me just to see if the video came out all right. If I can hear you clearly, if you have good lighting, if I can see you okay, all that. But what you can do is you can just record it using GoReact on Canvas. See how the video turned out, submit it then, and then just send me an email saying, "Hey, did you send me your submission?" Or, "Hey, did you see my submission?" That kind of thing. Okay?
But I don't want to submit it on Canvas until I'm okay. Like, I mean,
because you can submit as many times as you want.
Okay,
You
I
can
got
just
that.
keep recording and just keep overriding the file.
Already, no problem. Thank you.
Do you have any problems with that? Just let me know. Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to move on, but if you got any questions, feel free to click the raise hand button or ask me at the end of the lecture today. So, Chapter 10. I have repeated this about 1 billion times already, but I cannot stress enough just how important this chapter is among any in your textbook. You could teach an entire course just on the material I'm about to talk about today. Because very rarely when someone tells you to be a good public speaker or asks you what is good public speaking, would you say a good public speaker uses their hands while they talk? Or a good public speaker is really great at moving around the room and controlling their space? Or a good public speaker changes their tone and maybe gets a little bit louder at certain points, a little bit softer at others? You don't really hear those. You really just hear that a good public speaker has some vague confidence, or they're just comfortable up there, that they have something, some je ne sais quoi, to use my horrible French pronunciation. But the reality is that we really can break down public speaking into a series of demonstratable skills. Skills that all of us can do. All it takes is practice. So, to those of you watching this on YouTube, focus on the tiny man in the corner of the screen. Focus on what I'm doing throughout this lecture, and try to emulate that in your speeches, or at the very least, be aware of what you're doing with certain elements of your body during your speech. I'm going to identify some bad habits that I've seen a lot of public speakers demonstrate. I'm going to stress some good habits we want to help cultivate during our speeches. But throughout, you always want to try keeping what your body does in mind, because like we've talked about before, the mind doesn't like getting split into two tracks. It doesn't like doing one thing while focusing on another. So it might be a little bit hard to do everything that I describe in this lecture, but you'll find that the more you practice, the more you just work through it, the easier it will get. So while these are required for your speeches and not necessarily for your activities, I recommend you practice everything I'm about to talk about in every opportunity of public speaking you can. So we're going to go ahead and not change slides because that didn't work, okay? We're going to go ahead and skip the question of the day, but before we even get started in any of the individual elements of nonverbal public speaking, we're going to talk about the 4 main methods of delivering a speech. I want to go through them because it's going to address a lot of misconceptions some of us might have about our speeches and prepare us for a style we're not really familiar with, or most of us aren't familiar with. We're going to start first with scripted speeches. A scripted speech or a manuscript speech sounds just like it's written. Effectively, let me just move this little window. There we go. A manuscript speech is written out word for word. The speaker writes out every single word they plan to say for their speech. And then all they do is they just get up in front of a screen or an audience, they have the speech out in front of them, and they just read the speech word for word. They read it word for word, and therefore, it's very easy to deliver. It's very hard to forget a line when the script is literally right in front of you. Who do you think typically gives a scripted speech? Where do you think we might see a scripted speech? In the media or in the world? Anyone?
What is the question again?
Who do you think would typically give a scripted speech? Who typically gives a speech where they have it written out in front of them and then just reads it word for word to an audience?
Political people.
How so, Lou?
Because the only person that I didn't notice that doesn't read the what you call it, their notes, their speeches is, unfortunately, he's not my favorite person though, just to let you know. I don't want to be funny. President Trump, and then he has a notes on the top of the whatever you call that. But most of the people that I watch, they have their notes, they go look at them, and then they go keep the eye contact because that's probably how what do you call the people that write their speeches for them. So anyway, that's what I read.
Yeah.
And I noticed, excuse me, I noticed that. So
exactly. You're going to see every time a politician gives a speech, most of the time what they're going to do is they're going to glance down at the podium. They're glancing down because they usually have the speech pre-written and presented right in front of them. Now, what other example do you think you could give me? Who else might give a scripted speech? I just need one more example. Anyone? Who do you think would typically read a speech word for word? More specific question. Anyone watch the news lately?
yes, I watch news 3, 5, every single 8 o'clock, 11 o'clock.
You're keeping up to date, Lou. Well,
yes, because I want to see what's going on right now.
very much so, right? Well, a news anchor gives a scripted speech because right in front of them, they have a teleprompter. Everything they need to say, scrolling right in front of them, right? Now, there are, like I said, benefits of giving a scripted speech. You never miss a word. You never have to think about what to say. You can now fully focus on how you're saying something. You can completely ignore everything that you might stumble over. You won't miss a word. You won't say the wrong word. But there are some downsides of scripted speeches as well. There are some downsides in the same sense that I will know within the first 30 seconds of your speech if you're just reading it directly off the screen. Because very rarely in the past would I have ever encountered a student who brought their outline up and read it in front of the class as their speech. However, in an online class, that's more common than ever. Because what I see is people pull up a copy of the outline, put it up on their screen, and then just record themselves reading it. How do you think I will know within the first half a minute of your speech that you're reading directly off of it? Anyone?
The eye contact.
Eye contact. How so, Janelle?
Well, if you think about it, you're technically supposed to be looking at the camera, not all the time, but you can see the eye moving slowly down to follow their script.
Exactly. So people will already be able to pick up on it because eye contact, as we're going to talk about a little bit later, is the main way that you're able to engage with your audience. How else do you know that you're reading directly off the screen? Anyone?
Kind of, your body language can kind of tell.
How so, Rodrigo?
Well, first, like you said in the previous class, you can really multitask, do like two things at the same time. So you kind of make it apparent because you kind of sound like a robot because you are reading
Exactly
from the wall. So you're not moving your hands because you're paying attention to reading in the first place.
Exactly. When you read something, it kills all your other nonverbals because you're so focused on the act of reading. So many students, their speeches sound so monotone because they start their speech and it's always at this angle. It's always like this. So you get to see their chin, maybe a little bit of their lower face. And then they go, speeches are written completely, read verbatim. Who typically gives scripted speeches? Check the methods. Scripted, memorized. Oh, wait, sorry. Impromptu, extemporaneous. I'll know immediately because, yes, you no longer have to focus on the words, but you're not focusing on your nonverbals either. By taking the easy way out, it kills the energy and enthusiasm of your speech. So understand that, yes, the president might be able to give a scripted speech. Yes, Anderson Cooper might be able to give a scripted speech, but that's because if they say the wrong word, or if they forget a word, or if they mispronounce or awkwardly phrase or say anything in the wrong way as exactly written and intended, that could have huge consequences for so many people. I don't think your speech of introductions are that high stakes. So always keep that in mind. I really want to stress this because a lot of students are going to be tempted to just read directly off the screen. So we got politicians, we got commencement speakers, we got PR specialists, and next we're going to talk about memorized speeches. Now, memorized speeches, just like the name suggests, right? Speech is written out completely, word for word. However, now you're memorizing every single line of your outline word for word. And then you just come up and you try to recite it as best you can. Who do you think typically gives a memorized speech? Who memorizes their speech word for word and then comes up to an audience to give it? Anyone?
A professor.
So did I memorize it word for word, Rodrigo?
No, I'm just kidding, Professor.
Why do you think I didn't memorize it?
Because you at least the way I see it, you sound like you're having a informal conversation right now. So you're basically going through like topics, but you're not really like I can tell it's not trained.
How do you know I didn't memorize everything I just said, even to the point where I knew you were going to ask that question and I memorized the answer to that question, Rodrigo? How do you know at 3 in the morning I wasn't rehearsing you saying that exact
Because you don't know what's gonna come up.
Exactly. And that leads us into the pros and cons of memorized speeches. Because let me ask you this. Who, before joining this class, thought you had to memorize your speeches? Who wrote their outline and now thinks that for their speech has to memorize every single word of it? Anyone?
I did before reading chapter 10.
Exactly. It's a huge misconception because people think that memorization is the only effective way to speak in public. Let me stress this. Let me really set it down. Do not memorize your speeches word for word. Don't do it. Don't memorize your speeches. Why don't I want you to memorize your speeches? Anyone? Why do you think I don't want you to do that?
Because it's not on your rubric and you don't like that. And
Why do you think I don't like it, Lou?
say that again.
Why do you think I don't like it?
Because that's how you were trained. You are exactly doing the right thing that you were taught, and you want your student to be just like you.
But why do you think I was trained not to memorize my speeches?
Because it's not the right way.
Why?
I have maybe a point, because we want to memorize the abilities, or not memorize, develop the skills so we can deliver speeches not only one by memorization, but learn the skills to keep giving speeches in the future.
So you're saying I don't want you to memorize so you can focus more on your nonverbals?
In the outline and in the nonverbals, yes.
You're right, but we're striking at it a little bit. You're going at it a little bit too deep. The fundamental reason why I don't want you to memorize is pretty obvious. It's really, really hard to memorize a speech, especially for when you're going to give even longer speeches than this, because this is a 2 to 3 minute speech. Okay, you can memorize that, but a 6 to 8 minute, that's putting a lot on yourself. The reason I don't want you to memorize a speech, the reason why memorization is not the key to good public speaking is just like Rodrigo mentioned and like Lou mentioned. Memorization makes you stiff. It makes you robotic. It makes you a set of pre-rehearsed lines that are not able to maintain what's called a conversational tone. Conversational means that it sounds like I just got up here and started talking with you. I was able to ask you questions. I was able to change the content of my speech while I was delivering it. So I don't want you to memorize because it's going to kill your style of public speaking. You're so focused on remembering each exact word that you're not paying any attention to how you're saying those words. It's going to make you sound very flat and monotone. It's going to make you very unconscious of what you're doing with your hands, with your feet, with your eyes, and so on. So many speeches I've heard memorized that could have been improved so much more if the speaker had just broken free of their mold and left it a little bit up to chance. So I don't want you memorizing these speeches. You don't need to. It's not a required part of your grade at all, in the slightest. Break the mold of memorization and you'll see that public speaking becomes a lot more fun because you're able to invest a lot more of yourself into your style of public speaking. So, people who typically give memorized speeches are actors, wedding toast speakers, and so on. The reason why they have to memorize these is for the simple reason that an actor, yeah, they have to memorize it line for line because they can't really improv something on set. That might change the meaning of the scene. However, you're not restricted to a script. I don't have your outline open on another monitor while I'm hearing your speech. You're free to change any element. You're free to riff. You're free to go on a tangent and so on. You're free to do that because that gives you the opportunity to give your speech a little bit more energy, a little bit more life. However, there's the other end of the spectrum, impromptu speaking. Impromptu speaking, you might have heard of it before, is where you basically give the speech with zero preparation. You just get up there and you just start talking, and you hope that it comes out good. You hope it doesn't come out too bad. You're basically just hoping. You didn't have any ability to write it ahead of time. You didn't have any ability to practice. You just got up and there's the speech. What do you think are some of the benefits of impromptu speaking, of not having to worry about writing or practicing, of just getting up there and just talking, just giving the speech out of the blue? What do you think are the benefits of that?
It sounds natural.
How so, Rodrigo?
Because you basically having a conversation, because you're just talking whatever comes through your mind. I mean, I see it very natural. I don't know.
Exactly. It's the definition of natural. I mean, think about it. All personal conversations are impromptu. Very rarely do we rehearse when we're going to talk with friends, family members, coworkers, and so on. Most of the time, we just go up to them and we just start talking, and a conversation flows from that. That's what makes it sound natural and not stiff and robotic. So impromptu speeches have a little bit more life and personality to them. But what do you think are or is a downside of impromptu speaking? What do you think is a downside?
Professor,
Go ahead.
hey, I actually had to do one of those speeches today on my on a work class. I was getting certified and to be like a ground security person for my airline at the airport. And I actually got a compliment for using my hands while I was talking, because you had to do a simulation talking to a customer, but kind of having to do it in a speech way, because you're kind of telling them something, and you kind of had to sound really knowledgeable and polite. And they really liked that I was using my hands, and it was just something that I thought I should throw out there.
Exactly, like we talked about, a benefit of impromptu speaking is you're able to focus a lot more on your hands, on your movement, on your voice, and so on. How did it actually feel giving that impromptu speech that you couldn't practice or prepare for, Rodrigo?
I knew the subject, so I kind of knew what I was talking about, but I did feel lost a little bit in the end when I had to talk about something that I wasn't really familiar with. But it felt okay. I mean, I'd be practicing for the class anyway. But yeah, I think that would be an example of an impromptu speech, what I did today, I guess.
Very much so. And now you kind of related a little bit of the downside of impromptu speaking is that it leaves people out in open water. They have to come up exactly with what to say in a way that makes sense, in a way that also grabs the audience's attention. That's very, very difficult to do. Impromptu speaking is in a lot of ways even harder than memorized speaking, because now you don't even have the luxury of just memorizing something. You have to come up with a great speech on the spot. Most people don't do that. In fact, when most people try to do that, it ends up hurting them. An example of mine was that, I was at my best friend's wedding a couple years ago, and the brother of the groom raises a glass to give a wedding toast. He's been practicing it. Well, practicing is a little bit iffy of the term. I know he hadn't written the speech. I know he kept talking about writing the speech, but he raises his glass, and this was not his first glass of champagne, let me remind you. He raises his glass, he looks out to the audience, and then he looks down to me, he looks back to the audience, and then he sets down the glass, hands me the mic, and flees to the bathroom to go vomit. He put himself in that position because now it wasn't just he had to give a wedding toast, it was he had to make up a wedding toast then and there on the spot. That's a very difficult thing to do, almost impossible, in fact. Very rarely will you ever see a good speech made up on the spot. Very rarely will you see a famous or historic speech not already being written ahead of time. Very few good public speakers are good impromptu speakers. That's why we always want to practice and prepare ahead of time. That's what lets us focus a little bit more on our gestures, so we don't have to come up with creating a speech and focus and trying to come up with the words while also focusing on our nonverbals. So, lastly, I've talked about why you shouldn't memorize. I've talked about why you shouldn't give impromptu speeches. Now I'm going to talk about the middle ground. I'm going to talk about extemporaneous speaking. An extemporaneous speech has a carefully prepared written outline. It doesn't have the entire speech written word for word, but it has all the main points, everything that you would like to address. Maybe a little bit of a footnote here, maybe a little bit of a bullet point there, just enough to remind the speaker of what they're supposed to talk about next and what they're supposed to expand upon. An extemporaneous speech, it's usually delivered with almost no notes or note cards. It has a ton of practice put into it, and the reality is that extemporaneous style speaking works so great because it's designed to appear as if it's an impromptu speech. It's designed to appear as if someone just got up and started talking. Because the reality is that extemporaneous style speaking has all the pros of memorized speech in that you're able to practice and prepare ahead of time, and all the pros of impromptu speaking in that you're able to appear lively and energetic. I mentioned to Rodrigo a little bit earlier in the lecture, about 10 minutes ago, that this lecture obviously isn't memorized. But is it impromptu? Did I just make up this lecture out of the blue? 10 minutes before this meeting started, did I wake up from a bleary-eyed haze and go, oh yeah, I have to teach a Comms 103 class? I guess I'll just talk about chapter 10. No, this is an extemporaneous style speech. I practiced this lecture so many times before. I have a PowerPoint that serves as my outline. It doesn't have everything I want to say in my speech, but it has just enough that I'm able to expand and elaborate around each key point. By using extemporaneous style speaking, I hope I don't appear too boring, because if you just heard me read directly from the PowerPoint, or if it sounded like I just memorized a lecture word for word, it would sound very stiff and robotic. However, if I just tried to make up the lecture on the spot, I'd quickly lose myself. I quickly would make examples that don't make sense. I would quickly start repeating myself over and over again. You would start hearing a lot more uhs, a lot more ums, a lot more likes, and so on. So when you're giving a speech in this class, always aim to deliver an extemporaneous speech. That's why I had you write your outline. You don't have to memorize your outlines word for word now, but you can use the outlines as a good framework to start practicing. Now you can use your outlines to go, all right, so that's my attention gainer, and that's my thesis statement, and these are my two objects. All right, and then I first talk about this object, and I give this story. I then talk about my second object, and I give this story. For my conclusion, I just review, okay, what was my thesis, what were my main points, and what's a memorable way to close out the speech for the audience. That puts a lot less pressure on yourself, because now you don't have to memorize something word for word, and it gives you something to fall back on in case you ever lose your place, or if you don't really quite know what to say next. You also don't want to memorize because it also puts you a little bit in what I call railroad syndrome. I don't even know if that's probably a term, but oh well. What that means is that if you try memorizing something and if you forget just one word in that sentence, it's very difficult to continue on. You're typically going to lose your place just from stumbling over that one word, and it's very difficult to try to switch to the next one. So what I've seen is that a speaker can forget one word in their speech, it completely throws them off, and then they can't even finish the speech. So you want to aim for extemporaneous. Don't try to practice in terms of, did I get every word exactly right? Try to practice your speech in terms of, did I talk about everything I wanted to talk about? Did I mention my thesis? Did I mention my two objects in my speech? And so on. So aim for extemporaneous speaking. Now, the types of speeches we deliver are going to be extemporaneous. Here is just an example of, on the left, you'll see your, you will see your preparation outline. This is essentially the outline that you turned into Canvas on Sunday. You'll see that I asked you to write out your speech word for word when you turned in your outline to Canvas. You don't have to practice this for your speech. What you can do instead is you can take everything you wrote and then you can just reduce it to the key point of each sentence. Because you don't need to say word for word, texting while driving is extremely dangerous. You don't need to write that full sentence out when you want to deliver that speech. Because by just writing the phrase texting dangerous, you now know, okay, that's what my main point's about. That's what I should expand upon. By memorizing how the ideas flow and not how the words are arranged, you'll see that it's a lot easier to practice and rehearse for your speech. So, now that we talked about the 4 methods of public speaking, or methods of delivering a public speech, now we're going to go into the individual elements of your speech delivery. I've emphasized this about a dozen times already. I cannot emphasize it enough. Your speech delivery, how you say something, is just as, if not more so, important than what you say during your speech. Because how you say something helps actually engage and maintain the audience's attention. Words alone are rarely enough to keep the audience listening as we're speaking, especially with longer speeches. That's why we always want to try, taking a sip of water, that's why we always want to try to appear as lively and energetic as we can. I'm going to break down each individual element of your speech delivery. Focus on what I do with my hands, with my body, where my eyes go as I'm speaking. Focus even on the volume of my voice and try to apply that for your own speeches. So, first, we're going to go into gestures. Now, gesture, what we do with our hands, are critical to appearing lively and spontaneous to an audience. It's actually a little bit deep-rooted in our psychology where human beings actually need to see someone's hands. It comes from a very, very, very ingrained habit where we initially saw open hands as a sign of peace, as a sign that I'm not here to hurt you. If I show you my hands, it's not a fist. You can trust me. So we need to focus on the speaker's hands because it helps reassure the audience. It helps us appear a little bit more relaxed. It helps us appear a little bit more conversational. It also gives the audience something to focus on because what you can do is with your hands alone, you can emphasize key words and phrases. Because if you just try to talk like this, it's very difficult to try to convey the importance of an individual word because it doesn't sound as energetic. Think of it this way. The gesture itself doesn't even really need to match any kind of symbol or anything or a specific word or definition. When I make this gesture, does it really mean anything? Not really. This by itself, if I just went like that, doesn't mean anything. But just by emphasizing a word, by physically underlying it with my hands, it gives a visual frame of reference for the audience. They now understand its weight and they understand its importance. So you want to be using gestures during your speech. Some habits to avoid. First, and most obvious, keep your hands in camera. Always try to keep them in view. That means having your hands above the waist, visible to the audience. I've seen in a lot of recorded speeches, people use gesture, but it's always at waist level, and it's very difficult for the audience to focus on. If the audience can't see it, then it has no impact on your speech, and therefore will impact your grade. So when you're delivering your speech, focus a little bit on your hands. While you're practicing, watch the recording of yourself and ask yourself, okay, where did I keep my hands? Were they visible the entire time? Did I keep them apart from each other? Was I able to use individual gestures to try and emphasize key words and phrases? Focus on what you're doing with your hands because a lot of the time, our mind goes on autopilot on how we actually incorporate gestures into our style of speaking. Another thing to keep in mind is you want to avoid linking your hands together. You want to avoid meeting them together like this. You want to avoid this because you'll find that the more you join your hands together, the harder it's going to be to pull them apart. The more you talk with your hands met, then your mind's going to go a little bit more into autopilot. It's going to forget what you're doing with those hands. That's kind of why you want to hold them in the first place. By doing so, now you can't really gesture. It's not really interesting to watch me do this for approximately 5 to 6 minutes. So what you always want to try and aim for is keep your hands apart from each other, as far apart as you can, always on opposite sides of yourself. By doing so, now your gestures appear far more visible, far more energetic, far more spontaneous. You're able to accompany individual words with gestures and actions. Remember, the gesture doesn't necessarily need to mean anything by itself. This gesture doesn't mean anything, but somehow when you see it, your mind associates it with he's emphasizing a point, he's creating a little bit more flow to his sentence, and so on. It also makes you appear a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more comfortable, because this, when you're fidgeting with your hands, when you're pulling at your fingers, when you have them behind your back, that demonstrates, okay, they're a little bit nervous. They're a little bit unsure of what they want to be talking about, what they're doing. What you can also do with your gestures, remember, for your speech of introduction, you have to use your two objects. You have to show them to the audience. That means that your gestures can incorporate your objects. That means that, I swear I've repeated that means like 4 different times. If I want to show an object, I can incorporate it into part of my speech. I can show and say, okay, here's a fidget cube. Hold it up to the camera, okay? And what you can do with it is, I don't know, it's really good for idle hands. You got little buttons on this side, you got a little lever on this side, you got little dials on this side, you got a little flip switch on this side. No, it doesn't really do much, but when you're bored and you don't really know what to do with your hands, it's better than chewing on a pen cap, right? If you're using another type of visual aid, if say you have a PowerPoint behind you, then you can point to specific elements of that PowerPoint. You can incorporate it into your style of speech. All of these work to try and make the audience a little bit more active and engaged by your presence. Next is movement. You might have noticed that I haven't really stopped moving throughout this entire lecture. It's not just because I'm pacing, it's not just because I'm antsy. Here's something that almost every student going into this class has never really thought of before: where they're standing in terms of their speech. I will be grading how much you move during your speech. You need to move during your speech because, as we talked about, it's about engaging the audience's attention. The audience doesn't like looking at the same thing for an extended period of time. By moving around the room, by giving the audience something to track, something to follow, it becomes a little bit easier to look and listen to. It's a lot easier to maintain the audience's attention because now you're able to effectively utilize your space. If we were giving speeches in a classroom setting, I would say that movement helps even more because it's able to project to different aspects of your audience. It's able to have you speak to the front of your audience, same as the back of your audience, so that no one ever feels like they're excluded from the speech. Because if someone sat in the back row and just listened to you speak from half a classroom away, it's very easy, they're very easily going to tune you out. But if you get up and you move from the front of your space to the back, you're able to speak to everyone at the same distance. By doing so, you make sure everyone feels included and that they're directly being spoken to. You don't have to move all the time during your speeches because movement can quickly get distracting. Movement can get distracting just in the sense that if you always keep moving around like this, especially in an enclosed setting, then very quickly the audience will stop focusing on you and you'll lose them entirely. Because remember, nonverbals are a balancing act. What you do with one aspect of your body affects what you do with everything else. The more you move, the harder it's going to be to maintain eye contact. We're going to talk about eye contact in a second. So, a great balancing act when incorporating movement into your speech is what I call anchor points. Anchor points are when you just pick 3 specific spots around your space and you say, okay, I'm going to, at some point during my speech, move from all three of these spots. So let's say that I pick for my anchor points the left side of my screen, the center of this door right here, and the right side of my screen. That means that I can begin my speech by speaking in the center. I begin my speech and I don't need to start moving right away. I can start with the introduction. I can go a little bit more into my thesis statement. I can introduce my two objects. And then as I transition to my next main point, I can move to my first anchor point. In my transition, yeah, I'm moving, but now I'm at my first anchor point. I've barely taken a couple of steps, but I've already effectively utilized my space. I've already given the audience something new to look at and focus on. And just as I'm wrapping up my first main point, as I want to transition to my second, I can cross over, not even meeting back at the center, and move to my third anchor point. By doing so, now the audience is able to see that I'm able to utilize the entire space, even though I've been speaking for about a minute and a half, and I've only moved for about 5 seconds of that entire time period. So it's not about how much you move, but that you move throughout and utilize the full space of the classroom. Some bad habits to avoid are rooting yourself in place. Probably the single biggest point loss people suffer on these speeches is they don't move during their speech. Movement is at least 10% of the entire speech. And yet, in I'd say over half of all speeches I see, the speaker gets up, they plant themselves in one spot, and they only ever talk from this specific position for the entirety of their speech. Focus on where you're speaking. Just when you record your speech, scroll through it on fast forward, and you'll quickly see if you actually moved at all during your speech. Always incorporate that movement because you'll find that it goes a long way towards engaging the audience and appearing more relaxed and comfortable. If I'm able to move around this space, it looks like I own the space, like I'm comfortable, like I'm calm. I don't even technically own the space. I pay rent for it, but y'all didn't even know that, I bet. Well, you probably did because a public speaking instructor can't really own a house these days, but whatever. Next is voice. So you might have also noticed that throughout this speech and throughout all of my lectures, I constantly adjust the volume, pitch, and tone of my voice. You always want to be changing your volume, how loud or how soft you're saying something, your pitch, how high or how low you might want to speak, and your tone, what emotion you want to convey with your words. I'm trying to convey an emotion of passion and enthusiasm to you. I'm trying to make it sound like I genuinely care about this content and how you do on your speeches. I do, but the only way you can actually pick up on that is how I actually say it. You've probably heard or sat through a lot of boring classes. Those classes were probably boring in a lot of respects because of how your instructor actually lectured. If I came up here and if I just started talking like this, all right, we're going to start talking about voice. Voice persuades the audience to listen. It carries a consistent rate of speech, has variety and emotion. You want to avoid being monotonous. You want to avoid trying to sound like the same particular tone over and over again. Any questions? No? Okay, moving on. So you want to avoid ever saying something the same way. It doesn't matter how expressive you are, how loud, how soft, however your voice naturally sounds. You don't ever want to sound the same way for too long. Listen to your speeches. Listen to the recordings of your first speech activity, or maybe your second if you've already turned it in. Listen to how you sound. If you only ever sound one particular way. A monotone doesn't mean that you always just talk like this, flat and boring. A monotone is not necessarily the most uncommon kind of public speaking. A monotone is just when you only ever speak at one volume for the entirety of your speech. That's literally what it means, one tone. So always try to adjust accordingly. Voice is both makes your speech much more interesting to listen to And it gives that emphasis to specific words and phrases. It demonstrates emotion. It demonstrates that you are passionate about the specific topic. Because how can you deliver emphasis if you don't actually try to make that word stand out a little bit more? Think about it. If I wanted to deliver emphasis, I wanted to make you think that one particular word is more important than the rest, then I could just raise my volume, maybe emphasize my gestures a little bit more, and now you'll know it's something important. Conversely, you don't always have to be yelling to demonstrate that importance, though, because just by lowering your tone and your volume, you can try to create an atmosphere of intimacy, like you're speaking directly to the audience. I don't even know if the microphone is picking this up or if I sound ridiculous that just by speaking quietly. I could try to convey some kind of emotional sincerity, but that's just how far softening your tone can really go. You can also adjust your speaking rate, how quickly or slowly you're talking about something. You control the flow of your speech. You can get through it as quickly or slowly as you want. So don't be afraid to slow things down a little bit. Don't be afraid to take a pause every now and then for a breath or for water. It also is an effective public speaking tool because a pause during your speech is a great way to garner the audience's attention. The dramatic pause is also a great way to have the audience reflect on something you might want to talk about. If you want to hit them with a difficult question, put a little bit of a pause between your question and the rest of your speech. So you can ask them something like, when was the last time you talked bad about someone who wasn't in the room with you? Exactly. Well, moving on then, you'll see that a pause for effect leaves the audience a little bit more uncomfortable. You always want to try to break up the audience's expectations. If the audience is there to listen to you speak, they might not expect you to just sit there for 10 to 15 seconds of complete silence. You might have already gotten uncomfortable just from that brief period of silence. You weren't expecting me to actually shut up for a second. Always try to adjust that. Always try to talk or sound a more interesting, effective way. Think of how you talk with your friends, family, whatever. If you ever try to talk in a way that sounds boring, if you ever try to talk in a flat monotone, very rarely we do so. Most of the time we convey energy and enthusiasm just in our natural style of speech. Try to transfer that onto your public speaking. Next is language. Now, when I say language, what I mean is the words we specifically choose. We talked a little bit about that on Monday with chapter 9, but with language, we want to try to pick appropriate words to the specific occasion and to the specific audience, both so that we don't offend anyone and that we appear more credible, that we know exactly what we're talking about and who we're talking to. Yeah. You also want to try, like we talked about in chapter 9, to be vivid. Use descriptive detail. Actually try to convey emotion to the specific words you say. Try to use sensory detail. What did something sound like? What did something smell like? What did something feel like? All of these vivid details help your stories and speeches come alive to the audience. What you want to avoid are vocal distractors. I hear this in almost every single speech. You probably heard them from me just today alone. But what you want to avoid saying are us, like, you know, you guys. You want to try to avoid saying that because, like, if you just keep saying it, then it really just keeps breaking up the flow of, you know, your speech, and it's like just it almost sounds like I'm creating entire sentences out of that, and the more I keep trying to talk, the more aware like it feels to just keep just keep talking like this. And especially here in Southern California, this you just keep trying to find the next word to say, and your mind just keeps kind of defaulting to this, and it becomes a little bit harder to say. You want to try to avoid using those words. You want to try to have your sentence come out as cleanly and cohesively as possible. Because like, you know, and you guys always breaks up the flow of that. And the more you say it, the harder it is for the audience to pay attention to it. It's a very bad habit almost all of us have. Try to have a conversation with the person closest to you without saying like, or you know. It's actually pretty difficult. You'll find that as you keep trying, that you have to slow down each individual word, because now you have to pay attention to what you're talking about. It's ingrained, partly because that's the SoCal accent. We say like after every single word, and partly because those filler words are the mind trying to stall. The mind's trying to think about what to say next. It's trying to come up with that next word or sentence. When it can't do that, it puts up as a little bit of a delaying mechanism, like. It's your mind trying to think of what to say next. So try to avoid putting yourself in positions where your mind doesn't know what to say next. That's why you don't want to make up your speech on the spot. That's why you want to practice your speeches. That's how I'll know if you didn't practice your speech. Because if someone comes up and in the first 5 lines of their sentence, they're already saying that, hello everyone, my name is, even though I should know my name, but my name is Eric Johnson, and so that's like, but the reason why I don't want you to say you know is because it's redundant. What does that mean to say you know? What does it mean when I say, so I was going to the corner shop the other day and they were all out of goat cheese, you know? Am I literally asking you, do you know that? No. It's just my mind stalling for time again. And it breaks up the flow of my speech, you know? And lastly is you guys. You want to avoid saying you guys. Think about how natural that sounds. All right, guys, let's gather up. Hey, what are you guys doing over the weekend? Hey, do you guys know what you got on that last test grade? Sounds natural, right? But it's not. You guys is a gendered term. It refers specifically to men. Yet, we've accepted it as the default, as just the way to refer to everyone. But why does it not sound the same when I say, okay, girls, let's listen up. Okay, gals, come on. Hey, what'd you girls get on the last test question? Doesn't sound the same, does it? It's not an equal distribution. You want to avoid saying you guys because what you're effectively doing every time you're saying it is you're excluding at least half of your audience just through those words alone. You might not be doing it intentionally, but you're still doing it. And the fact that you're not even aware of it kind of speaks to the problem. True, we've all accepted it as the default, but if you flip it around and if you use a gender neutral way to refer to an audience, they'll pay attention to that. They'll learn that, yes, you kept them into consideration and that you specifically picked that word to keep them into consideration. You didn't want to exclude anyone. A word I like to use instead of you guys is you all or y'all. Try saying it, y'all. How y'all doing? Y'all ready to get started? Hey, what'd y'all get on the last test question? I like it. Gives me a little bit more of a colloquial, down-to-earth flavor, right? And you can use it in your speech. It might not sound like the most professional thing in the world, but who cares? You guys doesn't sound very professional either. You want to try to avoid using you guys for 2 reasons. The first is, of course, because it's the moral thing to do to create a more equal society for everyone, where everyone feels equally represented in everything we do and say. And for practical reasons, in that if you're showing half your audience that you're not paying enough attention to them to just change individual words you say, then they're going to be a lot less likely to listen to you. If you didn't keep them in mind, why should they dedicate their time to you? And so on. So, I'm more using this as a stalling tactic as I'm out of breath, but does anyone have any questions so far? Any questions at all? Okay. Well, next we've got eye contact. Eye contact is the most obvious one you might have heard. Now, you want to try and always maintain eye contact with our audience and, barring that, our web camera. We do this because the eyes are the primary way that we actually connect with an audience. Try to hold a conversation with someone without making eye contact with them. You'll quickly come across as rude or dismissive. You'll quickly come across like you're not really speaking to them directly. Have you ever tried talking to someone, but you tried talking to them while they were on their phone? Doesn't feel very good, does it? You'll usually ask them, okay, can you put down the phone and just listen to me for a second? Eye contact conveys attention. Eye contact conveys, I'm speaking to you directly, even if it might be through a screen. Because if I just try to keep giving my lecture like this, and if I just kept looking in every direction but my camera, then it quickly just looks like I'm talking to myself. It doesn't actually look like I'm keeping you in mind as an audience. Always try to make that eye contact with the camera. Some habits to avoid in terms of eye contact are what I call looking away to the sides and floor. Remember, the mind doesn't like being put in a position of creating new content. When it does so, it'll crane your eyes away to go, all right, I'm thinking of what to say next. It's coming to me. Okay, so here's the next sentence, but what do we talk about next? I don't know, maybe this, that, and so on. That's why you want to practice and rehearse your speeches. The less you have to think about what to say next, the easier it is to just focus in one specific direction. Something else to keep in mind is that, okay, so back to movement. We learned how to move around our room during a speech. Great. The problem is that when we move during our speech, the mind doesn't like that. It doesn't like moving while speaking. It needs to know where you're putting those feet. So what I've seen a ton of the time is that people move, but when they move, they turn sideways and then walk, pace, turn without making eye contact with the camera, and then just keep walking and looking in this direction. So yes, they're moving, yes, they're using gesture, but they're not actually connecting with their audience. Nonverbals in public speaking affect every element of each other. They're all in some way interconnected. So what you want to keep in mind is, okay, I'm moving, but I need to be looking forward while I move. I'm moving, but I'm keeping my chest pointed forward. A great tip for that is always try to keep both shoulders pointed towards the camera. Don't focus so much on the eyes. Focus so much on the shoulders, because it's very difficult to turn your head like so when you got both shoulders pointed forward. It's only when we turn our body physically that our head is going to follow. I'm doing a little bit of like a dance move there where I'm just like, but. So always keep the shoulders pointed, at least slightly forward, and you'll find it's a lot easier to maintain that eye contact. Do a little bit of that sideways movement where, yeah, you're moving, but your head's not leaving the audience. That way, you're demonstrating that confidence and capability to them. And lastly, let's talk about charisma, because that's probably the most common word you'd think of when I'd asked you to name a quality of a good public speaker. Charisma. What is charisma? Anyone? Any guesses on what charisma might be? To have charisma? What makes someone charismatic? Well, charisma, people would usually go, okay, charisma is confidence. Charisma is being able to just come up and just start talking and just being able to give a fantastic speech then and there, and never being nervous and having everyone wait on your every word. But charisma isn't some abstract trait. It's not something that you have or you don't. It's not something you were born with. Charisma is an impression the audience has of you. Charisma is just appearing relaxed, confident, and professional to a group of people. You do that through the demonstration of everything we just talked about, and we master it through practice. Every good public speaker didn't just start out that way. They didn't just come out born already able to deliver masterful speeches using their hands. They did so through practice, practice, practice. You can do it too. You just have to practice and rehearse your speeches. The more you practice, the easier it will be to use your body while speaking, and the more confident and professional you'll sound during your actual speech. That's how we create that impression. So that's why you don't want to angle your camera just so that you're seeing the top half of a face, and you don't want to you want to avoid using unprofessional sounding language by coming up and sounding like you're talking a little bit like you don't really know what you're talking about, and your posture's a little bit slouched, and your hands aren't really in the camera, and you're moving and you're sitting in one spot, and I don't know, you know, it's through what we do that affects how the audience sees us. So that wraps up our lecture for today. Does anyone have any questions for me before we head out? I am very tired, but let me tell you, this lecture really takes it out of me. Any questions? On the course, on the material, anything?
Just one question, Professor.
Go ahead, Lou.
Do you do that every semester on your class? Do you do that presentation that you just did for us?
Not only do I do it for every one of these lectures, Lou, normally I do this for every one of my lectures. This is how I teach. But I felt it was a little bit hypocritical that I do this lecture the same as I do all my other lectures when I'm asking you to do so much more for your actual speeches.
That's fine, thank you.
So yeah, this is how I teach. This is what I'm used to. Usually I teach to an audience. I'm moving around, I'm doing random stuff. I try not to sound like I work in a call center when I actually speak, but we make do with what we got. And I do all of it because I try to avoid boring my students. I try to sound as interesting and engaging as I can. And also so I can practically demonstrate the skills that I'll be grading you on. Any other questions? Okay, well, if we got no other questions, that wraps up our lecture for today. I'm gonna go take a big drink of water. Just as a reminder, your reading discussion is due on Friday, as is your second speech activity, the song of speech, which is going to help you practice how to change your voice during a speech. And on Sunday by 11:59 p.m., your speech of introduction is due. If you have any questions at all, feel free to stop in my office hours tomorrow from 2 to 3 p.m. or feel free to send me an email. Hope you all have a fantastic rest of your Wednesday. I'll see you all next week. Later.
Thank you, Professor.